Included in your toolkit is a set of tools to help you identify price pivots on your chart. If you're newer to trading and aren't familiar with pivots, let's begin by giving you a definition of what a pivot is. One definition is a price level of significance that is used by traders as a predictive indicator of market movement. As you learn more about trading and technical analysis, you'll find that there are many ways to use the different types of indicators, patterns, and how to interpret them. Pivots are no exception. There's a number of ways that pivots can be defined and interpreted. So let me show you how the toolkit identifies them for you. First of all, there are two main categories of pivots in the toolkit, an up pivot and a down pivot. An up pivot can be seen in this price chart of IBM, and it's identified by a price bar that has a higher high than the previous price bar, and it's also higher than the following price bar. When this is true, this price bar will be identified as a minor up pivot. And as you can see on this chart, there are two price bars that meet the definition of a minor up pivot. To identify a down pivot, we look at the low side of the price bar. If the low of the price bar is lower than the previous day's low, and it's also lower than the following day's low, then it's called a minor down pivot. As you can see on this chart, there are two price bars that meet the minor down pivot rules. One thing that you might ask though is, what about this price bar on the far right hand side? And the answer is that we don't know, and we won't know until the next bar finishes forming. Now let's go back to our chart of the Qs. To see the pivots displayed on your chart, click on Tools, choose the Expert Advisor, and then scroll down your list of experts here until you get to the expert called the MS 2010/Golson's Pivots. Now, before we attach this expert to our chart, we're going to make a couple changes. That is, I'm going to click over here on the Edit button, select the Symbols tab here, and here we can actually select what types of pivots we want to have displayed on our chart. So for this first one, what we're going to do is we're just going to have the minor up and the minor down pivots displayed. So I want to unselect everything else. And once I have these two selected, I'll click on OK, attach it to my chart, and then close down this dialog. Now the way that a minor up and a down pivot is identified on the chart is with a small dot either plotted above the price bar for a minor up pivot and a small dot underneath the price bar for a minor down pivot. If you take a close look at any of the price bars with these dots, you'll see that it meets the rules for the minor up and down pivots. Now once you understand how a minor pivot is identified, it's easy to show you how to identify an intermediate and a major pivot. Let's begin by plotting the intermediate pivots. So to do that, just right click inside the chart, choose the Expert Advisor, and then Expert Properties. Now inside the Symbols tab here, I'm going to select the intermediate down and the intermediate up, click on OK, and now what we've got is we've got some other symbols being plotted on our chart. Now you'll see some of the pivots have changed from a dot to either a blue or a red diamond. The blue diamonds represent intermediate up pivots, and the red diamonds are intermediate down pivots. The rules for an intermediate pivot are, instead of looking at the bar on each side of the pivot, the intermediate pivot looks at the minor pivots on each side and compares the higher low to those pivots. So for example, this pivot is an intermediate up pivot because it's higher than the previous minor up pivot and the following minor up pivot. This pivot is an intermediate down pivot because it's lower than the previous minor down and the following minor down pivot. And the last type of pivot that you have available is the major pivot. Again, to see the major pivot, what we'll do is we'll just right click in our chart, choose the Expert Advisor, go into the properties of it, and we'll select the major down and the major up. And what I'll do at the same time is I'll unselect the minor pivots because otherwise the chart can get pretty busy. So I'll click on OK. As you can see on this chart, you'll see that we have a major down pivot on this date because the low is lower than the previous intermediate down pivot and the following intermediate down pivot. If I scroll back on the chart here, we can see a major up pivot. Now here's a very important thing to understand about these pivots. Once a minor pivot is identified, that bar will always be a pivot point. But the type of pivot it is can actually change, meaning a minor pivot can become an intermediate pivot and an intermediate pivot can become a major pivot. As I said earlier, pivots can be identified and interpreted in a number of ways, but one interpretation is that if the market in the following period trades above the pivot point, it is usually evaluated as a bullish sentiment, whereas trading below the pivot point is seen as bearish. Let me demonstrate this for you and give you a little something to think about. Going back to our chart of the Qs, I'm going to right click inside the chart, choose the Expert Advisor, and go back into the properties. Now underneath the Symbols tab, I'm going to select only the major pivots. So I'll unselect everything else and click on OK. Now looking at this chart here of the Qs going back through 2008, notice that when the prices actually trade through the different major pivot levels, look what happened to the market. So going back to 2008, look at the market, or look what happened when the prices actually traded below this major pivot low. And look what happened when it traded above this major pivot high. And what do we have happening over here on the right hand side of our chart? You'll see that the prices actually have taken out the most recent major pivot high. So there's a number of different ways to use pivots, but identifying where the prices are trading in relation to the pivots, again, can be a very good thing to be aware of.